Live from London, this is BBC News. Humanitarian organisations plead with rival military factions in Sudan to stick to the latest ceasefire and protect aid workers.
It is not just the fighting, it is also the general security situation. We've experienced a lot of general lawlessness. It is an extremely volatile and difficult situation to operate in.
Russia has launched another wave of missiles at Ukrainian cities in the early hours of the morning, the second pre-dawn attack in 3 days. We'll go live to France, where the traditional May Day celebrations are being used for mass demonstrations against the increase in the pension age. And these live pictures right now from Paris. There was a downpour of rain earlier, but you can see police moving in there. We'll have the very latest live. And in the US, First Republic has become the third bank there to collapse in a matter of months and will be brought by JP Morgan Chase. Hello, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. This is BBC News. Let's go straight to those live pictures from Paris. You could tell that things were starting to be pretty... there you go, tear gas. That looks like potentially there. So potential disturbances there at those protests. We were live in Paris in the last hour or so, and scenes were pretty peaceful, to be honest. There was a huge downpour of rain and thunderstorms. Perhaps that was behind it. And I should always stress in these situations, although we're seeing these pictures right now, which are fairly dramatic, but of course there will be other areas of the protests which are much calmer. But as you can see there, this is Paris. As I said, these are live pictures, so we are watching these together, and you can see some clashes with police there. The reason behind this, well, in essence, it's about Emmanuel Macron, the president's pension reforms, increasing the age at which you can claim them, 62 up to 64. But actually, of course, as ever with protests on this scale, it is about much more than that too. It is about a general anger at President Macron. His popularity ratings have plummeted, frankly, of late, and also general dissatisfaction with a range of political grievances in France. And as always in protests and demonstrations like this, they seem to be rolled into one. And you can see there, we're just seeing these pictures of riot police with their helmets and shields taking some course of action. It is just the afternoon there in Paris, and we are expecting a day of protests, and they can go on for some time if history is anything to judge by. They can head on into the evening. We do have teams on the ground there. Nick Beak is our correspondent, who we spoke to a little earlier, and we will be crossing and speaking to him again at some stage, who can give us more of a flavour of what's happening. But you can see those kind of makeshift... Oh, that was an explosion just there, wasn't it? But that kind of fire there in the middle of the street, a little tricky to see exactly what's happening. Maybe let's take these pictures at full screen just for a moment, just so we can get a better idea of what we can actually be seeing there. We'll do that in just a moment. But just as the camera moves around, we can just get a better sense, I think, of what's going on. And let's go to them full screen now and try and get a sense, if we can see, of what is happening where and what side is doing what. Because in these clashes, traditionally, of course, you have a mixture of families and people just out on kind of more traditional protests, and then you have at the sharp end people with gas masks and the tear gas around there, and the people in high-vis jackets. And as ever with these kind of protests, the people are filming themselves, so we are due to get plenty more UGC video in the hours ahead of different people's perspectives of different parts of this protest, and we will be keeping an eye on that, and our team of journalists and producers here in London will be verifying the footage in the hours ahead, because of course online in situations like this, there tends to be lots of footage that pours out all of the same. Some of it accurate, not all of it though, and so that's why our teams work so hard to try and make sure that the pictures that we bring you are verified. But we're going to stick with these live pictures for the moment. That was the kind of makeshift fire that we saw just a little earlier on when we were doing the split screen. You get a better sense there with it full frame, exactly what's happening. It's a bit of calm there. Just remind you where this all kicked off. This is not out of nowhere. There are kind of two things effectively happening here. This is a very long-running protest against the changes to the retirement age, but also it's Labour Day, a traditional day of people, and not just in France actually, but across the world, out on the streets, part celebration, part protest, part strike at times, but this clearly not much of a celebration. This definitely conflicts there between protesters and police. Let's just try and listen in for a moment. So we get a bit of a sense of it there with the volume cranked up a bit. And it's probably worth just listening in again. There was chanting there. Let's just try and have another listen. So you get a sense there, the drum beat just on the far left-hand side of the picture there, and they're shouting and chanting as well. And just so you know, we have two different live feeds going on right now. This is one shot in the centre of Paris, but we have another live feed as well. Perhaps we can just show you that as well. So this is also in Paris. We do know, actually, just while we stick on these pictures too, that there are people out on the streets in other parts of the country, not just in Paris, but clearly the centre of some pretty significant disturbance is the capital right now. This won't have been unexpected. Authorities, police would have had some time to plan this because A day like this usually does bring people out anyway, but B, the intensity of the protests for week after week after week throughout France has been quite a surprise to authorities to begin with, but perhaps now no surprise that we're seeing scenes like this. And actually it's interesting, once the legal processes and the votes or the non-vote in Parliament over the pension reforms were all finished, there was speculation that perhaps now, seeing as these reforms seem done and dusted, there is perhaps little reason to come out on the streets anymore. But clearly that is not the case. People still furious at the changes, angry at the administration, wanting to show their anger and voice on the streets and demanding change, and that has led to these protests with these police officers here. Let's have a look at that other live feed now. I did say that we've got two of them going right now. So this is from a slightly different perspective. Can't work out the exact geography and location of these two live feeds. We'll do a bit of work on that and try and bring a bit of clarity on that. But we do have these live camera crews out in the streets of Paris. Just talking about the popularity of Emmanuel Macron, it's taken such a hit recently. Part of the political calculation, some have suggested that he won't be seeking another term in office. Therefore, he's prepared to take the hit to his popularity and push through reforms that he knows won't be popular at all. That's probably an understatement. But he's prepared to take that hit because he simply won't be looking for re-election. On the other hand, of course, his legacy, how he will be remembered by people in France, undoubtedly right now taking a hit. And perhaps the ferocity of the protests wasn't part of the initial calculation when the decision was made to push them through. Who knows? We won't know that until we hear from him, perhaps once he's left office in his memoirs. But his view very much was that this is simply a matter of economics. The country simply can't afford, with an ageing population, to keep that retirement age at that level. To give you some perspective, retirement ages, there are other countries similar in Europe that do have similar retirement ages. However, the majority have significantly higher, so retirement ages of kind of 4 or 5 years higher, and with plans to raise them still further. So it is seen by a kind of international standard that a raise from 62 to 64 not particularly demanding, but these things aren't ever as simple as that. Clearly it's not just about that technical 2 years. It's about a lot of the other technical changes that go along with it, and frankly a lot of other issues too. Let's just take a listen in and see what we can hear there.
I mean, hopefully we'd be in the right place for that.
Well, the corner's very good. That's one of my favourite corners.
Yeah, where they teach you to stick fairy liquid and sugar and golden syrup in the petrol box, right?
So we can hear the sirens going there. So there seems to be some kind of standstill there. You can see on the one side those very heavily defended riot police and protesters on the other side, and it seems like they're kind of effectively keeping a separation between those two sides of protesters there, with those police, that police line in the middle. And this seems to be an angle from effectively the other side, it seems, doesn't it? Actually, as I said, we will be working on just trying to work out a bit of the geography here to try and make things a little bit clearer, but you can see huge numbers. Absolutely no question of this particular street being under-policed. As the bangs go there, I was going to say no direct conflict right now, but as the officers move, potentially that's when things do escalate. But thankfully, no signs of that right now. So if you're just joining us, this is BBC News, and we are live on the streets of Paris as the protesters that you can see there have been clashing with police. We have seen what we assume is tear gas, people in gas masks, protesters pushing up against police and vice versa. But so far, no major damage that we can see from this live position. You can see the lines there of the officers, but we did see looked like a trolley on fire in the middle of the street a little earlier. But from what we've seen so far, no significant damage to buildings. You may remember those images a couple of weeks ago of a restaurant being burnt. It was one of Emmanuel Macron's favourite restaurants, and we have unfortunately seen buildings and property set on fire and smashed in previous protests. So far we have seen a smashed window, but that's it. As you can see, these officers here advancing. And we've been on these pictures for just 10-15 minutes or so now, because this is, there's a scuffle there. These pictures are a bit of a contrast to what we've been keeping our eyes across over the last couple of hours in Paris. When we were there a little earlier, there were people milling about. It was quiet. This was in a slightly different location, not on this street, but it was a bit open and a bit more wide streets. There wasn't direct conflicts going on there. That seemed very calm and peaceful. Then came a torrential downpour of rain, and usually that's what police are quite thankful for in situations like this, because that tends to A, calm things down, and B, send people home, and that means you usually have less trouble and disturbances. So from a police perspective, they weren't too unhappy, I'm sure, to see that rain. However, that has gone, and we are seeing a greater intensity, I suppose, now of these preparations by these officers, certainly in these police lines. Reminder, this all started, frankly, weeks and weeks ago. Protests against the pension reforms of Emmanuel Macron, and those protests simply haven't gone away. People simply have kept coming out on the streets. Fury at the increasing of the pension age from 62 to 64, many more angry with the principle behind it, many more angry with the technicalities, many actually angry with the process, not the basic parliamentary legal process behind it. There were appeals, didn't follow a more usual full-out vote. There were legal appeals against that. That's part of that. Detail is still being picked through. So various avenues of anger, and people now coming out on those French boulevards to express it. This is in East Paris. The team here are just telling me this is just north of Place de la Bastille. This is Boulevard Voltaire, as we've just switched from one live picture to the other. And we can see bottles now, looks like plastic bottles or glass bottles being thrown at that police lines, shields raised. And plenty of people there with helmets on and cameras. They tend to be journalists. So whenever you see a line, obviously, as you're all used to now, whenever you see a line of police forces and shields like that, despite the obvious risks, there do tend to be journalists right up that line, capturing the moment. So that's what some of the people right in front of that live shot there is. Okay, I think we've got another image to bring you now. This is, as you can see, an elevated shot there, Place de la République, and there it looks clearly once the space opens up a bit, there's more gaps and distance between people, and clearly in that spot there, which is clearly quite full, lots of people there, but no trouble, no clashes with police at that particular location from that view. Contrast that, though, to this. So this location is just a bit further south than the Place de la République that we were showing you from that top shot, that wide picture of lots of people peacefully milling around. This, we think, is a bit further south, Boulevard Voltaire, East Paris. And this is where there's been these confrontations, and you can see that kind of fire in the middle of the street there. France, of course, pretty used to protests and people coming out on the streets. You may remember the Yellow Vests protests that lasted a significant amount of time. They would come out every weekend, not just in any one particular city, but right across the country. And what was unusual about the Yellow Vest movement was that it didn't have a single cause. It was a very loose association of different people, different grievances, and different aims, different ends. And despite that, it carried on for an awful long time. People coming out, blockading roads and protesting and demonstrating on the streets. These protests here, not the Yellow Vests. These are protests with a specific purpose, a specific target, a specific aim, in name at least, which is these pension reforms. But of course, no issue is singular. There's always nuance and differences, and people will be out for various different reasons out on the streets of Paris. So as we get a bit of a lull here as they line up with their shields, perhaps we can cross and have a look at the other live camera, because people there seems to be on the move there. That's the wide shot. And let's go to the other live feed now, down back on street level, because people seem to be on the move on that one. So as you can tell, we are keeping across the 3 various live feeds that we've got direct access to here, but also our team in France and in London also keeping across UGC, user-generated content, which basically means mobile phone clips that people are filming out and about on the streets, and we're in the process of verifying and checking those, because protests can look similar. People can be deceived. People can put out false clips, false bits of video that they claim to be one thing when they're not. And we have a team here working to establish the verification and validity of those mobile phone clips. So we haven't got any of those to bring you right now, because those are being checked right now. And actually we've got fairly good angles covered of these protests. So the unions in Paris ahead of this were hoping for 1 million people to march through towns and cities throughout the day on Monday. There is always a big health warning with numbers, of course. In events like this, the first point is that estimates are very difficult to come by, and of course different groups have different incentives for increasing or decreasing the numbers reported. So it's always best to treat any numbers, especially when they're expected numbers, with a pinch of salt, but that gives you an idea at least of the scale that they wanted today. The union's very unhappy with Emmanuel Macron's administration, and you will have seen over the past week, so I'm just listening out at the same time here, just as you are, because these firecrackers, whizzes and bangs, a bit more regular now, aren't they? I'll just pause just to listen in just for a second. So we're going to assume that smoke there is tear gas, lots of people in masks. And you may have seen over the last couple of weeks, actually, Emmanuel Macron at various public events not getting a particularly warm reception. Not even just in France, he made a foreign visit too and was confronted there. Boos and criticism is following him wherever he goes at the moment. It was a level of criticism that he will have anticipated to some extent. He knows that he is not standing again to be president after this, so he can afford, in a political calculation, to take a hit in his popularity, to force through changes that he knows will be unpopular. Did he know that it would lead to scenes like this for such a long time? Clearly, we don't know. But the calculation in his mind has been that the French economy simply cannot afford to not do this. It can't afford to leave the retirement age at 62, relatively low in Western Europe. He has pushed through this increase up to 64, along with other changes too, of course. But his view is that with France as an ageing population, the number of people at work to support the number of pensioners, people's pension pots, the economic growth that you need to sustain an ageing population, things like healthcare, transport, housing and social care, that the country simply is not in a position to do nothing. And this is the move that he's decided to take on, and the protests he's been hit with have been ferocious and sustained. Right on the spectrum from what we're seeing here right now with riot police out on the streets and tear gas and fires in the streets at one extreme, right down to the other extreme, which is families coming out peacefully protesting and marching, wrapped in with strike days too, wrapped in with weekends, wrapped in with public holidays, a whole spectrum of protests and anger against Emmanuel Macron, not just on the pension reforms. He is unpopular for other reasons too, but that's partly inevitable. If you are a leader in a democratic country, of course, there will always be dissent and voices critical of you. But this single issue has provided a focal point, if you like, for all sorts of grievances. And people have turned out on the streets week after week after week. And it sees right now no sign of easing. We haven't got a proper idea of the numbers of people out here on the streets of Paris because in the moment it's almost impossible to know. People always come out with estimates beforehand. They're expecting X 100,000. The unions, according to Reuters, want 1 million people, not just in Paris, I should say, right across the country to come out and voice their anger. But we won't know. We won't know final numbers until long after the event, if we ever do indeed. I mean, unions do, for their point of view on the pension reforms, again, telling Reuters that trade unions say the money can be found elsewhere. So no one in France denying that money is at the heart of this. The economics need to make sense. They need to balance out. The President Emmanuel Macron is going for the idea that this pension age and pension reforms generally are the way to do it. Trade unions say the money simply can be found elsewhere. And that, at the crux, is the heart of these protesters out and about. For so many, that is such a crucial issue, but for others, much more widespread discontent. And as I said, we've been watching these pictures for a good few hours now. The initial protests, when it was dry, was relatively peaceful, and there are still huge pockets of these protests which are peaceful. People milling around fairly calmly, but the other side of that is these pictures, police with shields, men in masks and tear gas on the streets. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones, this is BBC News.